I also know there have been incidents over the years. For example, there was an intercept in Texas during George Bush, the younger George Bush's presidency, of an unidentified aircraft that was approaching his ranch. And FAA radars were tracking it. The Air Force scrambled some F-16s. And there was sort of a prolonged chase and engagement there near Stevensville, Texas. And during the AATIP program, one of the Air Force officers who had, top secret clearances and so forth, tried to interview some of the F-16 pilots, and they refused to talk. They said, we've signed non-disclosure agreements. And even though you're Air Force, and even though you're supposed to be investigating this phenomenon.
I just read there was a news 2 years ago in Oregon. There was you could listen to the ATC comm. Hey, there's this thing following us, and hey, it just disappeared, or something. It was something to that effect.
Yeah, that's a great example, because in that case, there were multiple commercial airline pilots that observed the aircraft. It was tracked by FAA radars. They had the altitude and the speed. NORAD scrambled 2 Strike Eagles, F-15s, to go after it. And yeah, so there have been incidents like that, and they don't get much, again, mainstream press coverage or reporting. But that kind of thing has been happening on a fairly steady basis for decades, actually. I interviewed.
Did the Eagles get to it? Did the Eagles intercept it?
They didn't. And they rarely do. I interviewed a Air Force colonel who served at NORAD headquarters, and he told me a story one day of showing up to work, and everybody was on their feet in the command center looking at the big screen. And there was a UFO coming down from the Arctic, from the far north, along the eastern seaboard of Canada towards the US. And according to Colonel Cobb, the commander-in-chief said, I want that thing. And they had everybody scrambling, putting everything in the air that they could that was on strip alert to go after it. And they couldn't get a radar lock on. They couldn't get close to it. It went all the way down the East Coast and then out over Cuba and south, maneuvered away from the Air Force interceptors, and they couldn't get a lock on. But those kinds of things we know have been happening for a long time.
How fast was it moving?
That I asked him that, and he didn't recall exactly. But even when our fighters on strip alert were being launched, well in advance of its trajectory, they were not able to get in front of it or get close enough to it to get radar lock on.
Is it possible that something exists outside the purview of the traditional intelligence ecosystem, perhaps a classified effort, something that exists so deep within need to know that someone like Chris Mellon wouldn't have been privy to it?
The answer is yes. There absolutely could be. This is an epistemological issue, and it's something that you've probably heard this many times in the intelligence community yourself, Rod. You don't know what you don't know. You can't prove a negative, right? So I can't stand up here and say, no, absolutely not. The other thing I would say about this, though, is that if it's true that we have, say, some debris that does not appear to be man-made, appears to be off-planet, I think the most likely outcome would be, if that were ever disclosed, would be shock that we've done so little with it or about it. Not that we're flying some secret space force and all this, kind of stuff. If we did have or do have that kind of absolute confirmation or physical confirmation, I think most likely it's in something that's just buried away in like the basement imagery in in these old movies where you have a bunch of boxes under a building somewhere with stuff that people have forgotten about with treasures in them. So it's worth digging into that further. Absolutely. This task force needs to do that. If there is something like this, it's outside the Special Access Program Oversight Committee. I served on that committee. I've talked to people who still serve on it, people in very high positions who are also very close to the minutia of the special access world. Those programs are reported to Congress. I used to review the WAVE special access programs that are only shared with a handful of people on Capitol Hill. And there was never anything I ever saw that had to do with this phenomenon in there. So there could be, but if so, it's probably very small, probably offline, and probably not contributing much of anything to elucidating what's going on here. If it's just a closed down R&D thing, and they've got some debris stored somewhere, I mean, I've heard legends and stories about this from people who really might know, and some of them have said, yeah, you know, there was some stuff, but they couldn't understand it, so they just packed it away, and they were so concerned about security they just buried it, and nobody's touched it or done anything with it. I don't know, but it's certainly part of what the oversight process at this point should entail, is digging into that. All nationalities, for example, there are these triangular shaped vehicles that have a light at each point of the triangle, and usually a red light in the middle underneath. And you find photographs, videos, reports from all over the world, people from every kind of background, military personnel, law enforcement personnel, mom and dad coming home from the ball game in a convertible with the top down. The Belgian Air Force encountered this, and over a period of several months there were thousands of individuals who had sightings. Their Air Force engaged.
There were thousands?
Yeah, thousands of personnel, thousands of citizens, to the point where the Air Force got involved and scrambled and intercepted one of these things. There's a F-16 radar, a video you can see of the radar track. And as this F-16 approaches this object, and there's gendarmes on the ground have reported it, and there's two different ground-based radars have identified this, and the F-16 is being vectored in. He gets it on the radar, and you can see what's happening on the screen. And this object goes straight up in the air, just vertically climbs right off the radar screen. It goes up like 11,000 feet or something in a matter of seconds. The F-16 loses it, but the ground-based radars still have it. And after that, the F-16 flies by, it drops down to like 100 feet over the deck under the radar.
The triangle, it's a triangular shaped thing.
Triangular shaped craft. And we've had law enforcement personnel. There was an incident in Illinois, for example, where a truck driver reported this thing. The police responded, and all of the communications and so forth, tapes are still available. The officers have been interviewed on camera now many times. And they reported this triangular object, and it continued. It was not that far from Scott Air Force Base. It continued over multiple jurisdictions. 4 different police departments, officers from 4 different police departments saw this thing and verified it. I've had a naval officer, for example, contact me, and he did not want any press. And I put him in touch with the task force, but he was not too far from the DC area and had an incredible sighting of one of these triangular objects, and he did a very detailed drawing and schematic and marked it up and everything, and he was interviewed by the task force. So there's a lot of strange stuff going on. So it's been going on at a far more extensive level than people generally realize, including flyovers of the U.S. Capitol in 1952 on 2 successive weekends. And it was front page of the Washington Post, letters this big.
Right.
Saucers over Capitol. And the Air Force Chief Intelligence holding a press conference.
What other types of vehicles have we seen? And
then recently there have been these so-called drones, which are these bright maneuvering lights that are low, and also all of these things are silent. They're all quiet. They're not making sonic booms. There's no loud jet engine noise or anything. And these drones are coming in groups, in clusters, and they're 4, 5, 6 of them coming up around a frigate, Navy frigate underway out at sea, and kind of swarming around it for an hour or two. And they're videotaping it, and nobody knows what these things are, where they're coming from, who could be operating them out at sea out there. They're so far from the coast.
Right. Well, you can do drones in formation. There's companies that do this for your birthday, yes. Right? They do things, but this is not what you're talking about.
Well, it could be. I mean, we don't know where they're from, but what's right. Surprising is that normally you have to be within a certain direct line of sight to operate those things. And normally you have a fairly significant constraint on time in the air because just of the energy requirement, right?
Yeah.
So this is going on in some cases night after night, hundreds of miles away from the shore in conditions of low visibility. And these things are not crashing in the water. They're not colliding. Right. They're maneuvering independently. So I don't think that's a case where we look at it and say, oh, that's beyond anything we could do. I think that's something we're potentially capable of doing. The Russians or Chinese are potentially capable of doing, but it's very unusual behavior. And to date, we don't have an explanation for who's behind it, who's operating these things, or what they are.
I could see, a submarine could come up and launch some drones to go observe you, but then you're letting us know that you're tracking, you're giving away a lot of information, and drones can't, my DJI drone can only stay up for about 15 or 20 minutes. Also, are they emitting, or do we have passive sensor data? Like, are they sending out electronic signals?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's a question I've asked that and about the radar, and I don't know the answer. I don't think we've picked up any emissions. I do think in some cases they have had onboard systems that try to jam the drone signals, the control signals, to cause them to drop.
Right.
So they can't maneuver. And I don't think those have been effective. I think they've tried that without result.
Right.
I'm not certain about that, but that's what I hear through the grapevine. So it's quite mysterious at this point. But it is provocative because of the type of facilities and capabilities that they seem to be interested in, and the behavior around them, which, as I said, seems intended deliberately to test our responses and capabilities.
Do we know where they go? People are seeing these things. So if it's around the boat, it seems like you could just see where they go, right? Like, do they go land on a submarine, or do they just plop in the water? Do they fly away?
This is why I was asking about the radar data to see where how far they could track them. They don't know where they're coming from or where they're going, and that's one of the principal unanswered questions at this point.
Right.
Very, very odd that they are able to find these ships seemingly at will, follow them, engage with them, and then slip away undetected.
But it turns out that when you look at, is it possible that someone could get here from a distant solar system? There is a theory now that is consistent with general relativity. And one of the things that's really curious and interesting about it is it explains all of those things. It's almost a perfect match. So there's something called an Alcubierre drive, named after the physicist who demonstrated this mathematically. And it's theoretically possible to modify space-time in the local vicinity of an object. So to those in the object, the equipment or the people, whatever, they would not feel as though they were accelerating. They would not be experiencing acceleration. And there wouldn't be friction, there wouldn't be noise, all the things, very consistent with what is being observed.
And then that brings us to Lazar's depiction of how these things worked, that they somehow or another bend gravity, these things that he worked on, which is the model that's on the desk there. That's supposedly a detailed model of what that thing looked like that he worked on. The sport model, I think they called it.
That's what he called it,
yeah. When you watch him talk and you hear him give his description of his time working there and what he saw and what he thinks those things are, what was your take on that?
I thought it was curious and interesting. I've been to Area 51. I didn't see any flying saucers or anything like that.
What did you see?
I saw Defense Department experiments being performed and training activities and that sort of thing. Nothing that the taxpayer would object to. But,
of course not.
But it's a big range. There's a lot of stuff going on out there, and there's a lot of adjacent ranges. If you look at the
Area
map,
S4,
actually,
where he was.
That's what he said. Yeah,
that's what he said. What's your take
I
on
found
him,
his
though?
explanations curious.
Yeah, how so?
The complexity of it, and the fact that he talked about Laurentium, for example, and then decades later, it turns out that apparently there is a more stable form of that than
That's element 115.
Sounds right. I couldn't tell you for sure.
But it's called Laurentium.
Laurentium.
That sounds like something from Battlestar Galactica. We need the
There's
Laurentium
all this stuff
to power
takes
the
you
ship.
into that,
Yeah,
right?
right.
So now I'm a little skeptical about his claims, I have to say. a friend of mine claims to know the gal who was his supervisor when he worked out there, and knows what he was actually doing and where he was located, and claims that he was a guy who checked radiation on badges.
That's it.
Yeah.
And so all the rest is fiction.
According to that story.
And this is a person that you know?
Yeah.
Maybe that person's full of shit.
Maybe.
How about that?
You know,
Maybe
I
they
don't
work for
have
the
the ground
government.
truth on this,
Yeah.
but
It's
but
interesting.
he did falsify his educational records, and he's been involved in some other things, and it just doesn't.
You
track
talking about
with
the
what,
MIT records?
Yeah.
Yeah. He explained that to me. He said that he was working on something for the government and they sent him to MIT to learn something. And I can't say too much. I'll tell you off air because he told me not to talk about it. But it makes more sense when you hear his description of it, that essentially it wasn't documented that he was studying there, because what he was doing was really a terrible thing, a terrible experiment they were working on. When I explain it to you, maybe it'll make more sense.
Okay.
Maybe not, though. Maybe he's full of shit. Maybe he lied about that. What's interesting, though, is he's told the same exact story since the late 80s. And he doesn't seem full of shit. Now, some people are really good at lying. And, I've been tricked before, and I'm sure you have, too. There's some people that are just sociopaths. They're really good at...
Yeah, they don't even know they're lying. They're convinced in their own head while they're spinning it.
He's obviously very intelligent, and he obviously knows a lot about science. He knows a lot about propulsion systems, and he really did work at Los Alamos, which is interesting because he's actually on the employee roster.
Yeah.
And they tried to say that he didn't. He knew people that were there. He knew the layout of the building. When he went there with George Knapp, they went through the building. He knew exactly where everything was, and he knew the people that worked there. So he really did work there, apparently, allegedly. His story, what's interesting to me is that, again, it's the same story over and over and over again. And then what's also interesting to me is that he knew and took friends to a place where they were testing these things out. And he knew where it was, and he knew when they were doing it, and he brought his friends out there, and that's when they got arrested. And
it's a very, I think there's some consistency there. That is hard to explain. How would he know where to go and what was going on? There are some possible answers to that. I've poked into this a bit. Supposedly, there was a bar off base where the scientists and a lot of the aviators and people would go and hang out. He was a frequented that place and picked up information. So, I hear stories on both sides of this. I don't know what the ground truth is, and I remain skeptical. But hey, there's a lot of crazy stuff going on.
I enjoyed his company. I went to dinner with him and Jeremy, and I talked to him for several hours on the podcast and off the podcast. I don't know, I don't. But it's a weird one because he never made any money doing that. He never made any money telling that story.
I'll tell you another story offline. We can exchange stories offline.
I'm excited. I can't wait for this to be over now.